Hello and welcome to Public Key, the podcast from Chainalysis. This is your host, Ian Andrews. Chainalysis recently reported that 2022 was the biggest year ever for crypto hacking, with $3.8 billion worth of digital assets stolen over the course of the year. The majority of the funds came from DeFi protocols, and it made me want to go looking for a solution. Is there an improving outlook for DeFi cybersecurity? My next guest, David Schwed, is Chief Operating Officer at Halborn. We get into the details behind the headline-grabbing numbers, and we talk smart contract audits and why you can't just rely on an audit alone to protect you from cyber attacks. David shares insights into topics like key management, the unique vulnerabilities of cross-chain bridges, and the need for decentralized projects to prioritize cybersecurity first. If you're looking for a detailed recap of 2022 crypto hacks, then head over to the Chainalysis blog. The team published a recap of the ups and downs of the year, including the biggest month on record, October, when $775 million was stolen in 32 separate attacks. As always, the link is in the show notes. It seems like 2022 was the year of security compromises across the crypto ecosystem, in particular in DeFi and bridges. So on today's show, I'm joined by David Schwed, COO of Halborn, the leader in advanced blockchain security. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to guess a lot of people listening to this are not day-to-day in the security world, particularly the crypto security world, and so they may not be immediately familiar with Halborn. Maybe let's start with, what does your company do? When should you get called in? Because we do get a lot of builders who are working in crypto. What's the right time to get you guys involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Halborn, really quickly, we're focusing on the convergence of Web2 and Web3 threats. So we work with some crypto native organizations as well as other large enterprise organizations that have Web3 projects, and we'll work with them to secure the entire ecosystem of that project. We don't narrowly focus, say, on a specific area like smart contract auditing or code review. We'll look at really any threat to that particular project, and then we'll offer security services around it. But, your first question is absolutely amazing because, it's one of the battles that I have with a lot of our clients and prospects is don't bring us in after you've done something already. Security should be done by design foundationally. I like to use analogies a lot when I'm explaining things. And, it's very similar to if you're building a house. You have an architect and you're building a house, you frame it and you build a house. You can't afterwards say, I want a bathroom over here. Maybe we didn't lay the plumbing correctly or there's not enough electrical. So it's very similar when it comes to security. You can always uplift a project afterwards by adding on certain type of security controls, but there are certain aspects of security that if not done correctly from the beginning, it's not something that you can always add in after the fact. So I always advise clients, engage Halborn or firms like Halborn, or, again, hire your CISO. Don't wait for that second round of funding to then bring in a CISO. Security needs to be done right by design. And if done correctly, especially in the crypto and the Web3 world, security is a differentiator on projects. I would be using and explaining how secure a particular project is as a way to differentiate myself from some of my competitors.
I mean, that's such a great point in a world where we see, many of the DeFi protocols are open source and have been cloned extensively. At the code level or the function of the automatic market maker or some other, liquidity pool structures, you can find lots of implementations there. I think today, many of them compete on available liquidity or types of tokens supported. But frankly, at a personal level, security is the number one differentiator, right? Because you might make an incremental marginal return by interacting with an exotic token, but you can lose 100% if security is not done right.
100%. And it's actually something that I always, talk about is yield has to come from someplace, unless you're printing tokens out of thin air, like some unfortunate organizations were doing last year, the yield has to come from somewhere. So what that means is they're either not spending the money on their security budget, or they're not hiring in certain areas, or they're taking some, fast and loose approaches to how they're setting up their infrastructure from a resiliency perspective. That extra, 100 basis points is being squeezed out of. If something feels too good to be true, or, this is, 15% return, again, money doesn't get printed out of thin air, it's coming from someplace. So be smart and be pragmatic about it. Don't invest in these projects or utilize these protocols and then turn around and complain when, there's a security breach. Like, the writing is on the wall with some of these projects.
Absolutely. I feel like I should have a box full of t-shirts that says, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is, and just hand them out all over the place. That's the thing many of us learned the hard way in 2022. I'm super curious, looking at your background, you've done an amazing number of things. You've been a CIO, you've been a CISO, you were global head of digital assets technology, you're an investor and an advisor to a number of other tech companies. How did you get into the world of digital assets? I think you started your career actually in law and adopted tech along the way. Give us a little bit of your origin story and particularly how you got into this crazy world of crypto.
So actually, the law came afterwards. So I started out as a technologist at a 20,000 foot level. My career started in TradFi in various infrastructure, infosec roles, risk management. I credit that with the way that I approach technology. I didn't come at this as a technologist as a whole. I came at this as a technologist, a risk management professional, as well as a cybersecurity expert. So when I'm looking at projects, I'm not just looking at this, for example, of what's the best infrastructure I can put up to for lower costs or for resiliency. I'm looking at it from how do I managing all my risk to this, and the risk could be legal, could be regulatory, could be reputational risk, in addition to cyber risk. So I really look at the whole ecosystem of risk, including cyber risk, when I'm looking at a project. So I really feel that it's really given me an amazing set of perspective when I'm working on certain projects. But my origin story is a little bit interesting when it comes to crypto. In 2008, I had co-founded a telecommunications company, and one of our customers was FXCM, and the CIO of FXCM at the time was Ivan Brightly. And I became very close with Ivan. And again, as a technologist, I was acutely aware of Bitcoin. I admittedly was rolling my eyes at it. I thought it was stupid. But when Ivan started walking me through not the monetary value of it, but this whole concept of a decentralized ledger and the ability to cryptographically send transactions, it piqued my interest. So I remember a very awkward transaction and handed him, I don't know what it was at the time, $100. When he transferred me some Bitcoin, and I was doing some test transaction and sending it back and forth, downloading the ledger, and I became enamored with it. Unfortunately, again, not from I didn't think it was going to be worth anything, so I didn't buy that many of them. I just bought enough to play around with, unfortunately. I've obviously since changed my view on Bitcoin and its ability to disrupt financial services, or enhance or strengthen it, if you will, not necessarily disrupt it. That's when I got into crypto. So I was a fan of the technology itself from 2012. My first job was as the Chief Security Officer for Galaxy Digital, and that also came about, again, through Ivan. Ivan at the time was working for Novo. I believe it was probably still a family office, and it was on the convergence of the creation of Galaxy Digital. And I had lunch with Ivan, and he said, we're looking for our first Chief Security Officer. Ivan functioned in that role as de facto because he had a security background. And, I went on a couple of interviews, met with some of the folks, and just thought it was such an amazing opportunity. As a technologist, one of the things that we love is something new, right? I don't want to do the same thing day in and day out. And although the technology at this point, I think it was 2018 when I joined, was already out for a good 10 years, it was still new and it was still emerging. And this was, as a cybersecurity professional, I couldn't just point to the NIST cybersecurity framework and just say, I'm going to go implement this. Here's the run book on how to secure a cybersecurity project. So this was interesting for me because, again, from my entrepreneurial spirit, it was, how do I do something new that's never been done before? So that's what drew me to that as my next career move.
I'm fond of saying, in 2 years at Chainalysis, I wake up every day and I learn about something that I didn't even know existed yesterday. And that pace of innovation and learning opportunity it presented for me is what's gotten me really excited about being in this sector. I'm curious, you're at Halborn helping run the business. Talk a little bit about who you all work with. I mean, I think some of the major chains like Solana and Polygon, some of the big NFT marketplaces, what's a typical engagement, and is it more than just smart contract audits that you're doing, right?
Correct. We're known for our smart contract audits, but like I said earlier, our goal is really to help our clients, or, I like to refer to them as partners because we're partnering together to secure the ecosystem. I like to work with our partners on really securing the entire project. So we do work with a number of organizations that come to us to do an audit of their smart contracts so they can get that, published report so they can, show the ecosystem, hey, you can communicate with our DApp or, our smart contract because, it's been audited by Halborn and it's secure. But some of the other engagements that we work with clients or partners is, we'll look at their web front end, right? There's always a front end component to a DApp. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't necessarily focus on that aspect of the security. They're only focused on the optics of security. When you go to organizations and they're showing you, hey, we're ISO certified and we have our SOC 2 and we have all of this. I'm like, well, that's great. That's for me as a client, but I really want to understand, what are you truly doing for security? What are you doing for key management? What are you doing for custody? What we like to do is we like to advise clients on, these are the other areas in addition to smart contract auditing that you should be looking at. at, like what's adjacent to smart contract, custody and key management. On the other side of it is, what does your CI/CD plumbing look like? We're going to have to look at, how is the code getting from the developer, up to the net, right? Like there's an entire process. How are you setting up your infrastructure that's hosting your nodes, your validators, or your web front end? Like those are all different points in the project in which there could be a potential, exploit. If I'm a threat actor, I may not be super concerned with, let me grab your keys because, maybe that's not the type of attack that I'm going to be implementing. Let me look at your vulnerability on your web front end. A lot of the hacks that we're seeing aren't necessarily Web3 focused key exfiltration attacks. They're traditional Web2 attacks that have Web3 implications.
I like to say that smart contract audits are necessary but not sufficient to achieve security.
100%. And the other area that, that I see is there's too much of a reliance on auditors as a whole to fix issues. Like the whole point of an audit is to say, hey, we're clean. We need you to come in and attest to the fact that we're clean. If we're coming in and we're finding critical vulnerabilities, that's great that we found them before you went live, but that shows that there's a root cause fundamental issue within that, particular client's organization that maybe don't have the proper security staff or the proper security training in order how to do secure development. Like there should be multiple eyes and multiple tests on that. Coming from a large bank, of course we use outside independent attestation, but by the time it makes it there, it's already gone through 100 different internal checks before we get there. If I'm working at a bank and I get back an audit report with no findings, I'm happy because that means I did my job. I've worked with Web3 clients where we'll do an audit and maybe they did a great job and we didn't find anything. They get upset. They go, well, what do you mean you didn't find anything? Like they want us to find things because they're looking at us as their security folks as opposed to an independent attestation. And I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in that because then you'll get like two layers of audits. You'll get the internal audit and then you'll get the external. Right now, I think like the stopgap, unfortunately, is the auditing firms coming in and doing a lot of the work that should be done natively by the project.
Do you think that's a point of maturity or just like organizational scale? I mean, a lot of these project teams are sub 100 people that I've interacted with. So I can imagine that compared to, say, Bank of New York or Citi or any of those organizations, you just don't have the staff capacity to run a full internal audit, let alone have the expertise that you might have in a bank.
It's a great point. There's a couple of things. One of it is, capitalization. A lot of these projects, they receive a $3 or $4 million seed round. What are they going to spend it on? In their mind, like I want to hire salespeople. I want to hire developers to build the actual product. They don't look at security as something that's going to, drive business, if you will, as they look at it as a necessity. So I've met with prospects and I met with clients who've actually said the words to me, we're going to address security once we get traction on the project because we want to spend our money on, actually developing the product first. I think it comes down to maturity as well as like understanding where security fits. And I think it also comes down to, unfortunately, budget. A lot of these projects, it sounds great to raise $15 million, but, the budget alone could potentially be 10 to 15 to $20 million as the project scales. So, unfortunately, I think it's kind of a mix of both. And I also think, from a maturity perspective, a lot of these projects are not able to afford enterprise level security people or the amount of security people that are necessary. You could have an entire team that's just networking security, an entire team that's just on data security, an entire team that's just on HSM, and an entire cryptography team. You're not going to go hire a team of 50 people. The project itself, only received $5 million worth of funding. The other side of the house is it's difficult, just like it's difficult for banks to attract Web3 talent, it's sometimes difficult for Web3 startups to attract, enterprise level talent. Somebody who's a managing director or a director at a large financial institution who has, arguably a decent amount of job security, are they going to take the risk to join a project that has enough funding just to get through 12 months to build an MVP to hopefully go back for their Series A funding? So a lot of the great security folks that have that enterprise level experience don't want to necessarily take the risk to jump into a project.
And I think the thing that's always struck me about crypto specifically, contrasted to all other software and application development, is compromise is immediately monetizable. There is money literally built into the thing you're hacking, whereas in almost everything else, it's very indirect. If you go pick, a hot new application in the App Store and you compromise it, in most cases, like you might get user credential information, but if the app hasn't gotten traction yet, you're really not getting anything of meaningful value. It's a limited scope. The stakes are so much higher for compromise. Like security seems like the one thing you just absolutely cannot skimp on.
Yeah, so you nailed it. I can't tell you how many times over the past 4 or 5 years that I've said the words, transactions are immutable and irrevocable, and that these are bearer assets. Whoever holds it, holds the asset. Multiple times a day do I utter those words because I think that's still something that, does not resonate with certain people. Because, if you look at, I can tell you conversations I've had with some bank, InfoSec people is they'll tell me, well, these controls or this security environment is good enough for X. why do we need more for digital assets? And I'll say, because transactions are immutable and they're bare assets. And if you access them, if there's a data dump of, PII or NPPI or PHI, whatever, sector you're in, whatever term you want to use, that's not the end goal. They then have to take that information and potentially sell it on the black market or stealing credit card numbers, or even if there is, someone is able to change wire info, there's still the ability to potentially claw back the wire, but you're absolutely right. These are immutable. They're bare assets. If somebody grabs it, which is why the threat actors are focusing specifically on digital assets now, because it removes, now I have to figure out a way to sell what I just stole. Fencing, I guess, if you will. In this case, it's the best hackers in the world on the bad side are now focusing on digital assets because the rewards are so great. Look at the total volume of hacks of last year in 2022. I mean, Axie Infinity alone was, 622 million. Even if they were able to stop a portion of it, hey, a $100 million windfall from a hack is still greater than trying to sell pennies of a credit card dump from, Target.
Exactly. One thing that you mentioned a moment ago, I want to go back to, when you move beyond the narrow scope of just smart contract audits, you said key management. I don't hear a lot of people talk about that, but it's come up here and there where people just have terrible key management practices. I'm sure you've seen some scary stuff without naming any names. We don't want to shame anybody publicly here, but talk a little bit about, what you've seen from the bad and what's state of the art when it comes to key management today for a team in crypto world.
I've seen things as bad as hard-coded private keys in GitHub repos. And, when I have conversations with clients, it's, things are like going back to the we'll fix it later. It's easier for us as developers to not have to build up like HashiCorp Vault or some other type of solution in order to now programmatically grab keys and use that to sign. So while they're developing the product, it's a lot easier for them to not build these types of key management safeguards. So again, not building it by design or using KMS or hosted HSMs, it adds to the development lifecycle. It potentially adds a couple of new hires because a developer isn't necessarily a cybersecurity expert, so they don't necessarily understand, HSMs or KMS or, how to stand up HashiCorp Vault, because it's not just enough to stand up, say, HashiCorp Vault or, something else. You want to now create logical and physical network segmentation. You want to build monitoring for anybody accessing those VPCs if you're building it in the cloud. There's a lot of layers that go into building a key management signing service. So a lot of early stage projects are just, keeping private keys in notepads or LastPass or 1Password. Although, keep it on a ledger because it will be a small project and the three founders will say, well, each one of the founders has a copy of the key on a ledger. And, again, that's not best practice. Now, on the best practice side, obviously, on the best practice side, there's a couple of different ways of looking at this. There's looking at a qualified custodian to hold your keys. Or looking at a technology solution, like a Fireblocks, for say, that's, utilizing multi-party computation. I'm a huge fan of MPC. I think MPC is a game changer. It's not new. I think that's also I think one of the misconceptions about MPC. This isn't a new technology. MPC has been around probably since, I guess, maybe the late 70s, early 80s. It's first popping up its head in crypto, but MPC technology has been around for a very long time. So it's not something that's just been newly developed. But I think one of the challenges is MPC is such a foreign concept for people to understand that they don't fully understand how to implement it. They don't fully understand how to use it. So I think that's also part of the challenge too. So I think there needs to be, for some of the smaller projects, a buy versus build analysis. Am I mature enough? Do I have the resources and do I have the knowledge and the wherewithal to build my own key management solution? Or should I be using a best-in-class solution, a la a Fireblocks, for example, that's using MPC technology? And for a lot of the projects, there's so much that comes into, you can't just say I'm using MPC, because you can have a completely insecure implementation utilizing MPC.
People's heads are spinning right now, I'm sure. The big takeaway in that last piece was don't have the founders carry around the private key on 3-ledger devices. That's marginally better than having it hard-coded into the dev repo, but still not secure enough. And MPC alone, while important tech, again, has to be augmented with good OPSEC practices around key management in addition to MPC. Did I summarize that?
100%. And the point with the ledgers are, it's not my go-to if you have the budget to stand up something better, but you can stand up something relatively secure with a ledger. Some of the things that I would tell founders to look at, number one is, are you taking advantage of all of the different added, security features of using a ledger device? For example, most people are not fully aware of the fact that you can use what's called a passphrase. And the passphrase functions as a secret 25th hidden seed word. And if everyone listening is, not necessarily familiar with like how that works, the seed, the 24 words is what's used to generate all of your keys underneath that. So that's the only thing you need to back up. So if you ever lose your ledger and you have a copy of your 24 words, you can then generate your private keys off of that. But now we get into operational security. Well, how do I safely and securely back up those 24 words? So what happens with the passphrase is you have this 25th secret hidden phrase that you're supposed to remember. And every time you want to access that ledger device, you have to enter in that 25th seed word. And if you don't put in that 25th seed word, the ledger device will be unable to generate those private keys to sign those transactions. So that, if the founders are going to use ledgers, I would say absolutely enable the PIN for the device, obviously, also the 25th seed word, and then also be really, really careful on how you're backing up your seeds, because I've seen some really bad backup procedures around seed, people putting them in LastPass. We all saw what happened with LastPass recently. I love password managers. I do. I'm a big user of password managers. But for something that is ultra, ultra secure for me, I won't put it in an online password manager, because the security is only good as the security of the SaaS that you're working with. And we also are here, they were able to steal an encrypted version of people's databases.
So ledgers are great for individual users looking to custody their own funds or NFTs, particularly when operated correctly, as you were pointing out. But as the backbone for a large, complex project with a lot of value locked in it, we probably want to look for a little bit more. I'm curious about something. We had the founders of Tenderly on the show recently. They're building, I think, a really powerful dev platform. And one of the things that I think they're intending to do is make one of the points you've made, bringing security into the early development practices, like core part of the architecture. They've got a transaction simulation feature built into the platform. Is that helpful in your opinion? This ability to actually simulate execution and kind of runtime vulnerabilities that people might encounter as they're actually writing contracts?
100%. This goes back to, it's two things. One is going back to quality engineering and quality assurance. Again, coming from a big bank, this is something that's just, BAU. Having environments that replicate your production environment to see how your code will interact and how it will behave under certain conditions, and then you can do things like fuzzing, and you can do all of these type of cybersecurity techniques to see how can it survive, again, even a DDoS attack, right? Like that's something that, most people don't necessarily focus on. They have to remember that there are certain threat actors that your goal necessarily isn't to exfiltrate data, it's to cause business disruption because, maybe it will cause the price of a particular token to decrease or increase, if they launch a DDoS attack against the Solana ecosystem. So yes, 100%, like those environments are absolutely 100% needed, just to test the behavior of your code to see how it's going to react. The interesting thing also is it's a tool for the bad guys to use as well. The smart contract code usually by design is available for open source, so you can grab it. So we're in a world where the bad guys have full access to test the code, to use the same tools that we're using in order to find vulnerabilities. So it's really like a whack-a-mole game at the moment as far as trying to find vulnerabilities and patch them, because the bad guys have the same level of insight and intel that the good guys are having at the moment. It's a little bit different than like a closed system, like an operating system like a Microsoft where it's closed source. You don't actually have access to the code, so a lot of the tools that the bad guys are using to try to find exploits, it's a little bit more difficult to find it. But if you can actually look at the source code yourself, it's a huge advantage, and the bad guys have those advantage. So these environments are absolutely 100% a necessity.
If you're not actively testing, fuzzing, and linting your code and using these simulation environments, you can bet the bad guys are, is what
Yes.
I'm hearing. They'll find vulnerabilities for you. You just won't like the price.
Exactly. Yes.
Does Halborn do this? Do you guys run red team audits or penetration testing and like the whole stack of cyber?
I mean, we do. So, one of the things that, we like to do for clients, when we're doing, again, smart contract, we do like, red team Web2 pen tests, but, when we're doing like a smart contract audit, one of the things that we like to do is, again, not everything is theoretical. We want to show them like, there's a practicality for this. I've been on the receiving end of a pen test audit where I'm looking through and I'm like, yeah, technically this is a vulnerability, but in the grand scheme of things, there's really no potential impact. And those type of reports really bother me because it shows they're not really necessarily looking at like, what is the true risk to my project? So what we like to do is when we're looking through the code and we find something that's a potential vulnerability, we'll actually also code a proof of concept exploit. So we can show our partner that, hey, listen, like this isn't just theoretical that we could do something. Here, watch this. We wrote a POC and we can actually show you that we were able to mint an unlimited amount of X. So we were able to grab the private keys. Again, there are many instances where we were unable to, or we don't even want to because it's such a critical vulnerability to actually do it. So we can clearly show them in the code. But in many cases, we will actually code the POC so we can show them that proof of concept.
Would you say over the last couple of years, are you finding fewer of those critical severe vulnerabilities, or is it going up?
Unfortunately, no. I still think clients are looking for auditing firms to be their security staff as opposed to like coming in afterwards for that, independent attestation. Coming from financial services, again, the auditing firms come in and all they do is here's my qualified or unqualified opinion. I think that's where we need to head, but I think we're probably 12 to 24 months out from getting the people to be trained to be able to do this themselves, and tools, right? Like there's not a lot of tools in place to, do these automated testing and stress testing and simulated environments. It's still a nascent technology.
Wow, I mean, we certainly saw that last year with the billions of dollars stolen. One of the biggest vulnerabilities that I've seen seems like it comes down to bridges, right? Like chains themselves, you guys at Halborn have audited a couple chains, but the chains themselves, I don't recall being directly manipulated, maybe some indirect market manipulation, as you mentioned, through DDoS. But when we get down to the cross-chain movement of assets, it seems like much more vulnerable environments. I'm curious, what's your take on bridges? Are they necessary? Are they forever vulnerable? Or is this just like a point of maturity in the cycle and not enough of them have retained your firm's services?
It's definitely solvable. I think we're a little bit off from it. People are so hyper focused on the smart contract code and not necessarily around the other aspects of security around bridges. Again, even physical and logical security and standard blue team monitoring and looking for, who's interacting with the bridge. Like there's still definitely going to be some patterns of behavior from an IOC, indication of compromise, or an IOA, indication of attack, that you could see maybe there's certain EOAs that are communicating with the bridge that are doing something that's a little bit anomalous. And then you can do some circuit breakers and you can maybe, put in some blocks to block those addresses. So like, in traditional firewall world, like intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. I think there's a lot of really cool startups in the space right now that are focusing on that. I definitely have my favorites of ones that I think are going to be leading the space. I'm super excited that, there's definitely people that are attempting to solve some of these problems. It's definitely not a level of maturity yet that I think it fully solves the issue. So there's that one aspect of it. I think if you look at like why bridges, it's a very difficult piece of technology to build because you're interacting with two completely separate layer one systems where you're moving assets from one to another. So there's going to be an aspect where on one side, you're able to communicate with the bridge and being able to mint, a wrapped, piece of token. And in order for that, minting to happen or issuing have to happen, it has to validate that you were able to deposit on one side. So if you're looking at some of the exploits of like, well, how does that happen? So if you look at like the Nomad hack, for example, one of the checks that it's doing is it's looking for, did this transaction happen? Or are we actually depositing the funds or locking the funds in a smart contract so I can issue it to you on the other side? And, in the case of Nomad, what they were able to do is they were able to see that there was a logic flaw on the issuing side. So that when you passed a transaction to it, and when it checked to see was the requisite amount of ETH, deposited on one side before we issue on the other side, they were able to figure out a way because it was like defaulting to, a state of zero, basically from an initialization perspective. So when you showed something that didn't match, it was automatically getting approved. So once they realized this, and again, this was like a crowdsourcing hack because everybody then was, figuring out that you could just very, very easily and simply just send this transaction and, being able to mint it. Could that have been prevented? Absolutely, right? Again, I don't know who the auditor was or if they were audited, but, these are traditional things that we look for, when, Halborn specifically, when we're auditing, we're looking for these types of validations. And again, there's other types of controls you can put in place. Like maybe there's some like time locks that you can put in. Again, everybody's like wants instant gratification, in today's world. Well, what if I told you, hey, listen, the funds are going to get locked up for 20 minutes while there's, an additional set of validation. I would feel as a user, unless I have an instant need for liquidity or make a purchase, I'm fine waiting the 20 to 30 minutes for my funds to appear on the other side if there's going to be that extra layer of controls instead of like this instant, I deposit and I want immediate access to the funds. So I think there also needs to be like a level set of expectations of like, in order to have, something that's truly secure, we need to build in multiple layers of checks and multiple layers of controls. And some of those are really time-based controls.
Slowing down the transfer of funds, there's an issue there where people then feel like they've lost custody of something, right? Like suddenly I'm no longer in control of the funds. And so I think a lot of people have this expectation of an atomic transaction. I deposit on Ethereum and I withdraw on Solana or two other chains, and they want that immediate gratification because it feels like nothing's really left their possession. you've just flipped networks. But you're totally right. It's that attempt at speed which is creating the opportunity for like what happened with Nomad, right?
Well, I mean, I hate to break it to the people listening, like, if that atomic swap instant gratification, makes them feel safer, you're still trusting the DApp. I mean, when you're giving access, to that token approval to access, your wallet, doesn't mean that you're immediately going to get access to it. So you've already granted them access. So whether you're getting it immediately or in 20 minutes, you're trusting them. All that's happening is, your anxiety disappears in a minute versus 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So, you're not really gaining anything by the instant access to those funds other than your own anxiety going away of, how my fund's going to get locked up. Because again, it just boils down to, not your keys, not your crypto. If you're doing a swap on one end, you're locking up your funds and hopefully getting it on the other side.
It's a pretty amazing one. You mentioned Badger DAO earlier. We've discussed that one on the podcast before. Some of my colleagues here at Chainalysis, assisted in some of the after incident recovery. That one was amazing to me because it was a compromise related entirely to their front end. They didn't touch the core Badger contract. They were able to insert a malicious contract behind the Wallet Connect function that had an authorization that people assumed was legitimate in order to send funds into the Badger bridge. And in reality, they were signing an authorization which allowed the attacker to pull funds out of their wallets. I'm curious your take on that situation. Like you mentioned at the outset that you guys kind of sit at this intersection of Web 2 and Web 3 security. That was very much a Web 2 style attack that just happened to be perpetrated on a Web 3 platform.
So double clicking into the Badger DAO hack, it really exemplifies the importance of securing the entire project itself. A lot of projects will focus on smart contracts, but they'll not necessarily focus on, what are the other attack vectors. And when we look at what is the weakest point in the infrastructure, many times it might just be the web front end. And in the case of Badger DAO, it was a lot easier for the threat actors to inject a piece of malicious code on the front end. They know clients are going to access the Badger DAO app through the website. They're going to click on the icon, and then they were just easily able to inject code in order to trick people into clicking into a malicious contract. And, it's kind of similar to the, to the Curve hack, where there was a DNS hijack. They were just redirecting users to another location. And it's not necessarily that these things are always 100% preventable, because again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's a silver bullet for cybersecurity and that they missed something per se. But when it comes down to a defense in depth of different types of tactics of both preventative and detective type controls, it's not enough to, okay, well, I'm using Cloudflare and I'm using a web application firewall, so therefore, poof, I'm protected and let's move on. That might be great for a SOC 2 or an ISO standard, or if you're filling out a vendor due diligence for a bank. They like those little check marks. But it really comes down to robust monitoring as well. Looking for these anomalies in behavior. Looking for a baseline of activity that, for example, for Badger DAO, this is the typical interaction that they have with their clients, and they're starting to see something that's anomalous to typical type behavior. That's when they'll put in a threat hunter, and that's when they'll put in a red team or a blue team, necessarily to kind of double click into what's going on. And I think that's an area that a lot of folks and organizations that are not necessarily doing well. They're doing a lot of preventative work, but there's not a lot that's being done on the detective side of the house. And, one of the benefits that we have in Web3 is everything is open and everything's transparent. You see the transactions, hitting the mempool before it actually happens. So you can actually see and watch the bad guys telegraphing certain things. One of the interesting things that was pointed out to me, by one of my engineers is also that we should be looking at test nets. Again, there's obviously going to be private test nets that we can see, but what we've been seeing is, the bad guys are actually testing out some of their attacks on the test nets before they launch on the mainnet. Because what other better way to orchestrate an attack than to test it on the test net? Because it's arguably, going to be the same code base, etc. So I think, detective controls is an area over the next 12 to 24 months that I would like to see many organizations really focus their attention on.
Who's doing really good stuff in the monitoring area? Like to me, coming from a Web 2 infrastructure world, I've been listening to people pitch me on observability and application tracing, application performance monitoring, all sorts of multi-layers of security tooling from intrusion detection and prevention to web application firewalls for years. And when I look at Web 3, it feels like very little of that has been implemented or recreated. Are there particular tools or vendors that people should be starting to look at? Maybe this is still an emerging space where it just hasn't been created yet.
It's definitely an emerging space. There's probably at least 6 or 7 that are in the DeFi security space that are all working on this problem, including Halborn, and we're actually going to be launching something most likely beginning of next quarter. But they're all focusing on DeFi security in the sense that they're looking at, again, from a behavioral standpoint, they're looking at how smart contracts are being interacted with while it addresses EOAs and different types of activities. I'm looking for, again, indications situations of compromise or attacks or anomalies or, a divergence from a baseline behavior. They're all doing it similar, but there's also something different to all these different tools. There are certain companies that are focusing on wallet integration. There are some that are focusing on browser extensions. So if you're using MetaMask, it's doing an inspection of the transaction before it gets signed. There are other ones that are also focusing on providing API feeds for enterprises, so that way they could just pass over the transaction via API and get a risk score back and then make a determination of whether or not they want to continue with the execution. And they're generally still in stealth, but there's definitely a few that I'm, particularly bullish on. One of them in particular is a company called Hexagate, which I think is a great company. I know the founding team pretty well. There's another company that I think is great is Ironblocks. There's another one out there called Hypernative. Redefine is another company that's addressing the same issues in the space. And there's a few other that are still in stealth that haven't come out with, but those are the ones that I'm particularly keeping my eyes on. And like I said, Halborn itself is also developing a tool because this is an area that we've, being asked for clients for recommendations. So we're building as a product called Trinity, which is a threat intel platform. So we're taking all of our knowledge that we've seen from the smart contract audits, using that intelligence and building that platform.
I don't know Hexagate or Ironblocks, so I'm going to have to follow up on those. We'll link to them in the show notes. Hypernative, though, I'm good friends with the CEO, actually. I love that they're on your radar. They're building some really cool stuff. I have a couple more questions for you. On the Oracle front, we've seen some pretty notorious, flash loan or asset price manipulation attacks happen over the last year. You guys at Halborn have blogged about better Oracle infrastructure and used some terminology that was new to me. We'll link to these articles so folks can go read the blogs in detail. But what is a TWAP Oracle or a TWAP?
Point of oracles in this case is, how do you accurately predict the price or not predict the price, but how do you show the price? And again, these are oracles because the prices are off chain. It's not necessarily something that you're fully going to gather on chain. So there's two different ways of looking at it. One is time weighted average price versus volume weighted average price. And there are definitely pluses and minuses to each one. And I would actually advocate the use of both, to be completely candid. They both have their advantages and their disadvantages. But the time weighted average price is looking at a single DApp or single DEX and looking through the transactions in the smart contract over a certain period of time to get that average price. The benefit is that you don't necessarily have to have an Oracle node or go off chain to get pricing from different exchanges, because with volume, you're basically taking multiple exchanges and you're averaging a price. You can do that in a shorter period of time because you're getting the data from multiple sources. So that way you don't necessarily have to say, what's the average price over an hour? Because obviously we all know an hour could be $1,000 difference, in the price of Bitcoin. So that's why sometimes the time weighted isn't necessarily your best option. You might want to go with volume. So that's why I would advocate doing checks on both sides. Check the time, check the volume, compare the two. If there's a huge delta that's outside of your acceptable risk threshold, maybe you want to, do a circuit breaker and maybe stop trading while you investigate the differences between the two. And there's nothing wrong with saying we're detecting some anomalies and we're shutting down trading for a minute. I think so many people are afraid to do that because it's supposed to be running 24/7. But at the end of the day, these attacks that are happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you're seeing something, it's best to, shut it down, take a look at it, and then re-enable. But I would definitely advocate looking at both, just because of the fact that if you're using the time weighted, while you do have the benefit of not having an Oracle node, if you're doing it over the course of an hour or 2 hours, the longer period of times, the less likely there's going to be some sort of price manipulation on the Oracle. If you're doing something on a shorter period of time, that's when you can launch a flash loan attack or something to try to fluctuate the price, which will then affect the price, coming, out of the Oracle. And if you do that over an hour period, multiple blocks, it's less likely that there's going to be something that's happening.
I love the enthusiasm, the optimistic outlook. It's rare to get that from a security professional. So I'm glad to hear it from you, David, because you're on the front lines of all this stuff. Thanks so much for joining us and talking through the landscape. It was a great episode. We'll have to have you on again later in the new year.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, thanks for listening to another episode of Public Key. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and our newly launched TikTok, where we share our favorite moments captured in the podcast and other great content from the Chainalysis team. And if you're into crypto policy and financial compliance, I bet you'll enjoy our new YouTube show, Know Your Crypto Compliance, hosted by my colleagues Clark Flint Barr and Caitlin Barnett. If you're interested in DeFi hacks and all things crypto crime, you're in luck. The 2023 Chainalysis Crypto Crime Report is now available. See the show notes for the download link. And if you'd like to meet the team behind the report live and in person, then you need to join me in New York City on April 4th and 5th for the Chainalysis Links Conference, which is less than a month away. And I would say get your ticket today because I'm expecting the conference to sell out soon. As always, you can find the registration details in the show notes.